So, today we're going to dive into something that's absolutely crucial for anyone working in education: designing culturally responsive learning. And we'll be using the really practical and insightful work of Dr. Simon Paul Atkinson as our guide.
Okay, but before we can even get into what culturally responsive learning is, we have to get something out of the way. We need to address the biggest, most paralyzing misconception about what it is not. Because honestly, when a lot of people hear this phrase, they start to panic. Just take a look at this image. I think it perfectly captures the reality of any modern classroom or training environment, doesn't it? You see all these diverse silhouettes, but notice how the colors just bleed into one another. There are no hard lines, no neat boxes. It's this beautiful, complex, overlapping mix of backgrounds that we're all working with. And this is where that panic really comes from. The fear is that you, as the course designer, are somehow expected to create a single learning experience that reflects every single cultural, religious, and linguistic variation on the planet. But as Dr. Atkinson makes crystal clear, that is not the goal. It's an impossible standard, and frankly, it would stop any of us from ever getting started. So, if it's not about designing for literally everyone all at once, then what is it about? Well, the real work actually begins by turning the focus inward. It's about becoming conscious of our own specific cultural context, this invisible lens that we, as educators, see and present the world through. Now, to really get this, we need to touch on two key academic ideas. The first one is ontology. It sounds complicated, but all it really means is your personal, fundamental belief about what is real, what you believe actually exists in the world. And the second piece of the puzzle, which is maybe even more important for us, is epistemology. I love how this is framed here. Think of it as the rules of evidence that live inside your brain. It's the framework you use, often without even thinking about it, to decide what counts as a fact, what you consider to be true, or what makes an argument valid. To make this all feel a bit more concrete, let's use this brilliant analogy. Imagine you have worn blue-tinted glasses your entire life. You don't even remember putting them on. They're just part of you. So for you, the world just is blue. That's your reality. That's your ontology. Now, if you point to a white wall and say to a student, "Look at that blue wall," they're going to be totally confused, right? The point isn't to try and take your glasses off. The point is to simply say, "Hey, just so you know, I'm wearing blue-tinted glasses." You have to make your invisible lens visible. All right, so let's move away from the abstract theory and look at how this plays out in the real world. How does this invisible lens actually show up in our educational settings, and maybe more importantly, in the actual materials we give to our students? Well, Dr. Atkinson provides a really fascinating contrast. In Aotearoa, New Zealand, for instance, it's common for course design to explicitly acknowledge the indigenous Māori worldview as part of the overall academic context. The science doesn't change, but the way it's shared, the storytelling around it, the community aspect, that shifts. Now, contrast that with the UK, where the default is often to just teach, which really means presenting the Western academic tradition as if it's a neutral, universal default, and then expecting this incredibly diverse student body to do all the heavy lifting of adjusting to it. And this failure to acknowledge our own lens can get baked right into our course materials. Atkinson shares this, well, it's a classic story, might even be apocryphal, but it illustrates the problem perfectly. The Open University UK was developing a physics problem for a course meant for the Arab Open University, and the example they used involved barrels of beer. And here is exactly why that matters. It creates something called cognitive friction. For a student in that context, their brain doesn't just jump to calculating velocity. It gets snagged on the scenario itself. Barrels of beer? Why? They're forced to spend precious mental energy just trying to translate the cultural context before they can even get to the actual math problem. In effect, you're not testing physics anymore. You're testing their cultural fluency. So what's the fix? The solution is to create what Atkinson calls cultural autonomy. And here's a brilliant example from the London School of Economics. Tutors had students, who were already naturally sitting in groups based on their country of origin, choose a brand from their own home country for a marketing activity. Just like that, the students become the experts on the context. All that cognitive friction disappears, and it frees up all their brain power to focus on the actual lesson. Okay, so that covers activities you might do in the classroom. But what about the very foundation of a course? You know, the reading lists, the textbooks, the articles that we present as the authoritative sources of knowledge. This is the big audit we all need to do on our own courses. We have to really look at the voices we're holding up as the experts and ask ourselves, whose epistemology are we privileging here? Whose rules of evidence are we presenting to our students as the default standard? Now look, this inevitably brings us to the whole dead white men debate, but the source material here is really nuanced and helpful. The point is not about creating some kind of political diversity checklist. Of course, in some disciplines, say the history of a specific Western philosophical tradition, the prominence of those voices is completely logical. The real question isn't about politics, it's about educational efficacy. What mix of voices is going to provide the richest, most effective learning experience for all of our students?
And here's a perfect example of why asking that question is so powerful. In a lot of Western thought, we draw this really sharp line between the logical mind and the emotional heart, right? But if you introduce a concept from, say, Neo-Confucian epistemology, you learn about the heart-mind, the idea that logic and emotion are an inseparable, integrated whole. Now, bringing this idea into the classroom doesn't erase Western thinkers. It enriches the entire conversation and gives every student a much more complete picture of what it means to be human.
So, we've talked about the instructor's role in the course materials. The final piece of this whole puzzle is about empowering the students themselves. It's about shifting our mindset from a model where the teacher has to manage all this diversity to one where the learners get to explore it together. And for that, Dr. Atkinson developed a really practical framework called POISE. It's essentially a set of structured questions that faculty can use to help their students actually see and understand the different epistemologies, all those different blue-tinted glasses that are right there in the room with them. And the questions it asks they're profound. It gets students talking about things like, how is authority viewed in the educational culture you come from? Or what's the role of group work versus individual achievement? Or even, what do you consider to be a valid argument? And when that happens, suddenly all that diversity in the room is no longer a problem for the teacher to solve. It becomes the primary learning resource for the students themselves. And this brings us to one last really provocative question to leave you with. We've spent all this time learning how to identify the invisible human lens. But as AI becomes our teacher, as it starts generating our course materials, summarizing research, answering student questions, how are we going to identify its invisible, programmed lens? These systems might seem objective, but they are absolutely wearing heavily tinted glasses that were programmed right into their training data. The real challenge ahead is learning how to see the lens of the algorithm before we all unknowingly adopt its version of reality as the only truth.